You think you know the story of the 2008 financial crisis. You've heard the headlines: housing bubble, Wall Street greed, Lehman Brothers collapse. But what if I told you the real story of that crash started decades before the world economy exploded? What if I told you that millions of families lost their homes, millions more lost their jobs, and entire nations fell into chaos not because of one bad year but because of decisions made quietly, strategically, and carelessly over 30 years? Today, we're unraveling the truth behind the global financial crisis, how it happened, who caused it, and why the system was designed to benefit a select few. Before we go deeper, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Stay with us until the end, and let me know your thoughts in the comments because this story is darker, bigger, and more shocking than anything you've ever learned in school. To understand the 2008 crash, we have to rewind to the early 1980s. This was an era of deregulation, bold financial experimentation, and a new breed of bankers who believed they could bend the global economy to their will. The United States had just survived a brutal period of inflation. Interest rates were sky high, and traditional banking, which was boring, predictable, and heavily regulated, was on its deathbed. Then came Reaganomics. The government began relaxing the rules that were designed to keep banks stable and safe. Suddenly, bankers who once lived like middle-class workers were becoming the rock stars of the financial world. Money started moving faster, deals got bigger, and risk became the new religion. But deregulation alone didn't cause the crisis. What truly set the dominoes in motion was a new mindset, a belief that banks could invent complex financial products faster than regulators could ever hope to understand them. And none was more dangerous than the mortgage-backed security, or MBS. On paper, it seemed like a brilliant idea. Take thousands of individual home loans, bundle them all together, and then sell them as a single package to investors all over the world. This way, banks didn't have to wait 30 years for homeowners to pay back their loans. They could get their money instantly by selling the loan off to someone else. For a while it worked beautifully. Wall Street loved it. Investors loved it. And most importantly, banks were now financially incentivized to issue more loans, and more, and more. But here is the crucial detail the textbooks never seem to emphasize. The demand for these mortgage-backed securities quickly became much, much bigger than the supply of qualified homeowners. By the mid-1990s, Wall Street's profit machine needed millions of new loans to keep feeding itself. And instead of slowing down, the banks made a fatal choice. If there aren't enough qualified borrowers, we'll just start lowering the standards. Welcome to the era of subprime lending, where your credit score didn't matter, your income didn't matter, and your job stability didn't matter. If you could breathe, you could get a mortgage. If you couldn't read the contract, even better, you were the perfect customer. This predatory strategy was not random. It was targeted. Banks specifically went into low-income neighborhoods, immigrant communities, and minority areas, places where financial literacy was often low, and convinced families who had never dreamed of owning a home that they were approved. They used deceptive tools like adjustable rate mortgage with low teaser rates that would later explode. They inflated incomes on loan applications. They faked job records. They coached people to lie. They built an entire empire of debt on the backs of the people who trusted them the most. By the early 2000s, Wall Street was absolutely drowning in these toxic loans. And the rating agencies, the very institutions that were supposed to warn investors of risk, were giving these junk mortgage bundles AAA ratings. That's the same safety rating as U.S. Treasury bonds. Why? Because Wall Street was paying the rating agencies millions of dollars in fees. And nobody wants to scare away a client who's making you rich. Then came the financial nuclear weapon, the CDO, or collateralized debt obligation. Think of a CDO as a Frankenstein monster stitched together from the leftover scraps of mortgage-backed securities. These were the absolute most toxic pieces, the worst loans from the worst borrowers. But through creative financial engineering and the paid-for cooperation of the rating agencies, they were magically transformed into safe investments. Pension funds bought them. Major banks bought them. European governments bought them. Insurance companies bought them. Everybody, everywhere, was holding a piece of this ticking time bomb, and most of them had no idea. By 2004, risk had seemingly vanished from the financial system. Or more accurately, everyone just pretended it had disappeared. The Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan, kept interest rates extremely low, believing that markets could regulate themselves. Wall Street convinced itself that home prices would rise forever. And consumers believed that cheap loans would always be available. It was the perfect illusion. But here's the part no one ever talks about. Wall Street insiders knew the collapse was coming. A small group of hedge fund managers, traders and analysts, saw the red flags. They saw mortgages going bad, foreclosures rising, and borrowers defaulting at record levels. But instead of warning the public, they placed a massive bet against the entire financial system. They purchased something called credit default swaps, which are essentially insurance policies that pay out billions if mortgage securities fail. So, when the housing market inevitably collapsed, they made a fortune. 2006 was the turning point. For the first time in years, home prices stopped rising. Those adjustable-rate mortgages began to reset. Monthly payments suddenly doubled, then tripled. Millions of families went from being approved homeowners to being bankrupt, seemingly overnight. Foreclosures surged. Panic began to spread. Mortgage companies started collapsing, one by one. But Wall Street kept telling the world, "Don't worry, everything is contained. Everything is fine." It wasn't. By 2007, the entire global financial system was secretly on life support. Banks were lying about their losses. Rating agencies refused to downgrade the toxic assets they had once blessed. The Federal Reserve was quietly pumping billions of dollars into the markets to keep them afloat. But the foundation was gone. The housing market, once the engine of American wealth, had completely rotted from the inside out. And then, on September 15, 2008, the world watched in horror as Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old institution, filed for bankruptcy, triggering the largest financial panic since the Great Depression of 1929. In the chaos that followed, trillions of dollars simply vanished. Banks froze all lending. Stock markets around the world crashed. Millions of people lost their jobs. Entire countries like Iceland and Greece went bankrupt. All of this happened because of decisions made decades earlier. All because risk was turned into profit, and profit became everything. And here is the cruelest twist of all. The people who caused the crisis walked away rich, while the people who trusted the system paid the ultimate price. But the worst part? That's only the beginning of the story. In 2007, when the first cracks appeared on Wall Street, the world barely noticed. Investors from London to Tokyo looked at America's subprime mess and just shrugged. To them, it seemed like a local problem, unpleasant, but nothing serious. After all, the US was the richest country on earth. Its banks were supposed to be the most advanced, the most sophisticated, the most regulated. How could a few bad home loans ever cause a global catastrophe? But what no one knew, what no one could have known, was that Wall Street's financial inventions had already spread across the globe like a silent pandemic. Mortgage-backed securities from California were sitting on the balance sheets of banks in Belgium, pension funds in Norway, and even government institutions in Germany. Complex financial products stitched together from Florida loans were being used as collateral for new loans in Switzerland and Ireland. The global financial system was already contaminated long before the first American homeowner missed a payment. It just didn't know it yet. The moment of truth arrived on September 15, 2008, when Lehman Brothers collapsed. This wasn't just another bank going bankrupt, this was the oxygen of global finance disappearing overnight. Lehman had $600 billion in assets, spread across dozens of countries. When it went down, every single institution connected to it. Every bank, every investor, every pension fund, every insurance company felt the shockwave in seconds. Traders in Tokyo walked into their offices to find their credit lines completely frozen. Banks in London suddenly refused to lend money, even to each other. The European Central Bank watched in horror as all the money in the system seemed to evaporate like water on hot asphalt. And then there was Iceland, an entire nation whose banks had borrowed 10 times the size of its economy. Its financial system didn't just stumble. It collapsed, literally. Within days, Iceland went from being one of the fastest-growing economies on the planet to total national bankruptcy. ATMs stopped working. Supermarket shelves went empty. The country descended into chaos. But Iceland was only the beginning. In Europe, the crisis morphed into something even more dangerous, a sovereign debt meltdown. For years, countries like Greece, Portugal, and Spain had been borrowing money cheaply, thanks to the confidence created by the euro. But as the global money machine seized up, investors suddenly demanded much higher interest rates from these weaker nations. When they couldn't pay, their debts exploded. Greece became the epicenter of this new disaster. Its government was forced to admit it had been lying for years about its finances, hiding huge deficits with the help of, ironically, the same kind of complex financial instruments designed by Wall Street. Once this was exposed, the country collapsed under its own weight. Unemployment skyrocketed to 27%. Suicide rates shot up. Children were fainting in school from hunger. For the first time in decades, Europe was staring at the real possibility of a currency breakup that could have dragged the entire continent into a new Great Depression. Meanwhile, in Asia, countries that had seemingly done everything right still suffered. China's massive export economy was heavily reliant on American consumers. When U.S. demand vanished, factories all across Guangdong province shut down. Over 20 million Chinese workers lost their jobs almost overnight. In Japan, the yen surged as global investors fled to safety, which in turn crushed Japanese exports. South Korea saw its stock market plunge by over 40%, forcing the government to beg the U.S. for an emergency supply of dollars. Singapore, the financial hub of Southeast Asia, fell into its worst recession since it became an independent nation. Even countries with almost no direct connection to U.S. mortgages felt the blow, because global trade itself was collapsing. Huge container ships sat idle in ports. The cost of shipping goods fell by 90%. It was as if someone had simply turned off the engine of globalization. Across the Middle East, the price of oil crashed from $147 a barrel to just $32 in a matter of months. Oil-rich nations saw their budgets crumble. Dubai, a city built on colossal amounts of borrowed money, faced a debt crisis that nearly bankrupted the entire emirate. Massive construction projects stopped overnight, leaving luxury towers standing as skeletons in the desert. In Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar, sovereign wealth funds lost hundreds of billions of dollars in just a few weeks. In Africa, the crisis hit in quieter but equally brutal ways. The prices of commodities collapsed. Foreign investors pulled their money out of emerging markets. Countries like Nigeria, Zambia, and Angola watched their main sources of revenue completely disappear. Millions of people were pushed back into poverty. Global aid dried up. It was a silent catastrophe, but a catastrophe nonetheless. Even Russia, armed with its vast oil wealth and national pride, was not spared. Its stock market collapsed so violently that the government had to shut it down multiple times just to prevent total annihilation. Russian oligarchs lost billions of dollars overnight. One of the richest men in the country, Oleg Deripaska, saw his entire empire crumble. The Kremlin had to intervene aggressively to stop a nationwide bank run. In Latin America, Brazil's booming economy was thrown into recession. Argentina faced another currency crisis. Mexico, deeply connected to the U.S., saw both its exports and the money sent home by its workers collapse, sending shockwaves through its economy. No region escaped. No economy was insulated. The entire world was drowning in America's financial hurricane. What made this crisis so different from all the crashes that came before it was interconnectivity. In 1929, financial contagion traveled by telegram and by ship. In 2008, it moved at the speed of light. A housing default in Nevada could wipe out a pension fund in Denmark, which could then trigger a credit freeze in London, which could then cause a bank run in Ireland, which could then collapse the national treasury of Greece. The world had become a web, and when one strand snapped, the entire structure shook. The global credit markets, the very lifeblood of modern civilization, froze to a standstill. Companies couldn't get loans to pay their workers. Banks couldn't borrow money to stay alive. Even governments couldn't borrow to fund their daily operations. If this crisis had been allowed to continue for just a few more weeks, global trade might have stopped entirely. Supermarkets in major cities would have run out of food. Hospitals would have run out of medicine. Planes would have stopped flying. Most people don't realize how close we came to a total systemic shutdown. This wasn't just a recession. It was a near-death experience for the modern world. But this brings us to a haunting question that economists still debate today. Why did the whole world put its trust in a system that was so fragile, so brittle, that the failure of just one bank could almost bring an end to globalization? The answer points to a much deeper truth, one that most people never knew. For decades, governments all around the world had allowed their financial sectors to grow into monsters too large to control. Banks used offshore loopholes to dodge regulations. The credit rating agencies happily stamped toxic assets with AAA ratings. And politicians, desperate for economic growth, just looked the other way as debt soared to historic, unimaginable levels. Ordinary people had no idea that money itself, global money, was being created in the shadows by private institutions that were accountable to no one. Wall Street wasn't just selling toxic loans. It was exporting them to the entire planet. European banks bought them to chase higher profits. Asian investors bought them to diversify their portfolios. Middle Eastern wealth funds bought them because they were told they were safe havens. Everyone trusted the system. Everyone assumed the math was sound. Everyone believed the machine was unbreakable. They were all wrong. And when the machine finally broke, the world learned a brutal lesson. In a globalized financial system, a crisis in one country immediately becomes a crisis for everyone. And behind all that chaos lay an uncomfortable truth. The real cause wasn't just greed. It was the illusion of safety that fooled governments, economists, banks, and billions of people all at the same time. The collapse that changed the world forever. But here's the part almost nobody understands. The 2008 crisis didn't end when governments bailed out the banks. In many ways, that's where it began. What you're about to hear is the hidden aftermath, the second half of the story that textbooks skip. Because once the dust settled, something far more dangerous emerged, a world where the very institutions that caused the catastrophe became even bigger, richer, and more powerful than before. And the consequences of that shift are still echoing today, silently shaping your life, your economy, and your future. When Lehman Brothers collapsed and AIG was rescued, governments around the world suddenly realized something terrifying. The global financial system was like a living organism, one that was already sick, unstable, and addicted to cheap money. The interest rates that had been kept low for years to fuel growth now had to be pushed even lower, down to near zero. Central banks didn't just cut interest rates. They opened fire hoses of money through a new weapon called quantitative easing. Think of QE as a massive blood transfusion for a dying patient, trillions of dollars pumped into the system just to keep it alive. But here's the twist. Those trillions didn't go to ordinary people. They didn't go to rescue families who lost their homes, businesses that went bankrupt, or pensions that evaporated overnight. They went right back into the same broken machine that caused the collapse. The banks, the hedge funds, the investment giants, the corporate elite. And as markets recovered, something began to shift dramatically. Wealth started concentrating at a speed never seen before in modern history. Between 2008 and 2020, the rich didn't just get richer. They became untouchable. The top 1% gained more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. CEOs earned bonuses so massive they looked fictional. Wall Street posted record profits year after year. Stock markets exploded upward. Meanwhile, for everyone else, wages stagnated. Savings died. Housing prices skyrocketed completely out of reach. An entire generation became renters for life. And for the first time, people started to realize the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to. But what most people still don't know is that the 2008 crisis also rewired global power itself. Before the collapse, the United States was the uncontested center of the financial universe. But after the collapse, China seized the moment. While American banks were drowning in toxic assets, China went on a global buying spree. They bought ports, mines, factories, farmlands, and secured energy contracts. They even started buying entire economies through the Belt and Road Initiative. The West was busy repairing the present. China was buying the future. And then came the second unseen shift. The crisis destroyed trust, not just in banks, but in governments. Citizens around the world realized their leaders would save corporations before saving people. This single realization created a massive chain reaction. It sparked populist movements, fueled political polarization, and led to protests, revolutions, and a global distrust that still drives elections today. The 2008 crisis didn't just rewrite the economy. It rewrote society itself. But what if I told you there was a final twist, something even darker? Because behind every crash in history, there's always a winner. And in 2008, the winners weren't the governments, not the bailouts, and certainly not the taxpayers. The winners were a small circle of investors who had predicted the collapse, positioned themselves early, and walked away with billions. Figures like Michael Burry, John Paulson, Greg Lippman, and a handful of hedge funds quietly made fortunes so massive they looked unreal. When the world burned, they cashed in. And while they're often portrayed as heroes who saw the truth, the real story is far more complex and far more uncomfortable. Because their profits didn't come out of thin air. They came from the losses of pension funds, insurance companies, retirement accounts, and ordinary people who never even knew they were part of the bet. And that brings us to the most important lesson of the entire 2008 crisis. The one nobody teaches, the one nobody wants to confront. The global financial system is built on confidence, not stability. It continues only because people believe it will continue. But the moment that trust cracks, even just a little, the entire structure trembles. Today, many of the same warning signs that existed in 2007 have quietly returned. We see rising household debt, inflated asset prices, speculative bubbles in tech and real estate, banks carrying hidden risks, and governments printing money faster than ever before. The system survived, but it didn't fix itself. It simply evolved into something bigger, faster, and more fragile. And here is the haunting truth. Every financial crisis in history has one thing in common. They always repeat. Not because people forget, but because the incentives never change. So if you've watched all the way through, drop a comment. I'm watching the system. Because now you understand more than most people in the world. More than many bankers. More than politicians. More than the average investor. And if you want more deep cinematic breakdowns like this, subscribe, like, and share. On this channel, we don't just explain history. We expose the truth behind it.